Hey everybody, what's up? This is Seth, and this is the next episode of the Take 3 Theological Variety Hour. I'm here with Erica and Christine, and this week is Mary Week. We're going to be talking about a lot of things about Mary. I am going to be going over some of the Marian feasts that occurred this week, and then we're going to hear from Christine about Nestorianism, which is heavily involved with the whole idea of who Mary is and how we should talk about her. And then Erica is going to talk to us about traditions surrounding St. Lucy or Santa Lucia, whose feast day is on Friday this week. So welcome everyone, and let's get started. So I just want you all to know that I have my Juan Diego shirt on, and I'm wearing a Mary belt, and I have 2 tattoos of Mary, so I feel like this is my moment.
So you are totally legit. You were born for this.
I was born for this. My whole life has been coming to this point right now.
Awesome.
So there are 3 big Marian feasts this week. One of them is kind of new, at least new to the universal calendar. So we had Immaculate Conception on the 8th, which actually fell on a Sunday this year. So at least in the U.S., I don't know if they did this everywhere in the world, but in the U.S., they transferred the feast to Monday. And it's usually a solemnity and a holy day of obligation, but in the U.S., since it fell on Sunday and was then transferred to Monday, it wasn't actually a holy day of obligation, which I think is weird, but that's how we do it. So that was Sunday/Monday. Then yesterday, we had the Feast of Our Lady of Loretto, which just, I think last month, the Holy Father announced is now a universal optional memorial for the church. And then tomorrow we have the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. So we've got a lot of Mary things going on today. I feel like we could have a whole podcast about Mary, so I've got notes. I'm going to try to keep myself limited to what I cover, but and I specifically want to talk about mostly the idea of the Immaculate Conception, since it is a holy day feast, and also the idea of Marian apparitions.
Can we somehow fit in Mary as my homegirl? Because I think that's a very, very important Tumblr.
Shoot, is she still doing that?
No, because she graduated, so she was only doing it during her degree.
Oh, is it still up though?
I think it is.
Yeah, that was good stuff. That got me through our doctoral classes, actually. We should invite her to be a guest speaker. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that I actually found out today that one of our professors from Loyola, Mary Christine Athens, who was a Sister of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, actually passed away on Saturday. Dr. Athens was really helpful to Erica and I, especially in a project that we were doing on the TV show Carnival. So it was sad and surprising that she passed away, but she left behind a great body of work. And one of her texts is actually called In Quest of the Jewish Mary, which is a really great text about just the doctrinal development of Mary in the church. And specifically looking for her Jewish roots. I did check out a couple things with this text, but mostly what I was relying on to prepare for this episode was Yaroslav Pelikan's book on Mary, Mary Through the Centuries. So one thing that I want to just kind of get out of the way is that a lot of times people outside of the Roman Catholic community have this notion that Catholics worship Mary, and definitely it's probably fair to say that if you're someone from the outside looking in. But whenever we're talking about Mary, and especially when, we're going to see this with Nestorianism, is whenever we're talking about Mary, for the most part, we're really talking about what it means for our understanding of Jesus Christ. And as far as the worship of Mary goes, Catholics do not worship Mary. There is a distinction, a technical distinction about adoration or worship versus veneration. adoration is only owed to God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Veneration is what we, offer to the saints. So,
To be fair, though, just I know how a lot of times there are certain Catholics that will be encountered by non-Catholics, and it's very, very easy to come to the conclusion that they're worshiping Mary.
oh yeah,
I totally get that. And there are, like, I'm a Catholic and I'm down with Mary, but some of my fellow brothers and sisters, like, even to me, I'm like, that's kind of extreme.
yeah, calm down.
It's a little much. Yeah, chill out, bro.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the Mary camp myself, but I definitely see how some people, and you know what, some people probably do cross that line. It's people who, popular devotions kind of can do different things than what's quote unquote official, but the official line is that we don't worship Mary, so just so everybody knows. So, yeah, so one thing, a really great quote that I wanted to bring out of Mary Christine Athens' book, I just found it this morning when I was looking at the text, is what we encounter, and especially a feminist critique of Mary in the Catholic Church. First of all, aside from Jesus, the largest looming figure in Catholic theology is by far Mary. I mean, we talk about Mary a lot. And again, it's almost always related to what we believe about Jesus. And that may be a little bit different when it's like when you're talking about a Marian apparition, but even Marian apparitions, usually what Mary's saying in the apparition is something about Jesus. So, this kind of feminist critique of Mary is that she's held up as, the ideal woman, but she's also a woman that no other woman can be because she's a virgin and also a mother. So, like, if you're trying to be like Mary, you definitely can't. And also, it definitely collapses women's roles into two very specific images, at least how they're portrayed by the church. So, Mary Christine Athens in her text talks about how when she was growing up in like the 40s and 50s, Mary was held up as this ideal woman figure. And for her and for other women that she knew, it was hard to kind of live up to that role. I mean, it's impossible to live up to that role. And so it was sort of like, you remember the WWJD bracelets. Mary was held up as like, what would Mary do if you were a girl? So Mary Christine Athens in her text says, this is a quote, just about like how it was hard to kind of do things and always have this picture of Mary in your mind. She says, quote, "It was hard to think of Mary chewing gum or going to a beer party in shorts or riding in the back of a convertible under a full moon on a balmy summer evening." So it's like Mary becomes like so venerated in some circles that it's like she's not even a human being anymore. And actually, I ran across this, and I think I vented to Erica about it. I found a blog online a few months ago that was arguing that Mary never menstruated because she was immaculately conceived. And it's like, she's
How would
still
she
a
have
human
been
being.
betrothed to Joseph? Because my understanding is in cultures throughout the world that one of the few universals, I guess you could have some initial, when they had the child betrothals, but really it's all formality until, like, there's no, the marriage can't happen until that happens,
Okay.
right? So I
mean, and it's just a weird, like, kind of offensive thing to say about women. It's like, oh.
Well, the idea is that that
Oh.
the cycle is part of the curse from Eve. It's part of what women deal with as a result of the fall. And maybe not, but just culturally speaking, that would have raised a lot of eyebrows in Jewish culture at the time, because would have been noticed.
Yeah. Right.
We'll put it that way.
So, in thinking about the Immaculate Conception, especially, I really was thinking a lot about how, Mary was a real woman, and I think Mary Christine Athens in her book is really looking at that, like, who was this historical Mary? Because with all these doctrinal, and dogmatic things that we go through in the church with Theotokos, with Nestorianism, or with the Immaculate Conception, I think it takes Mary and puts her like up above the Jewish woman that she actually was historically. And I thought about this especially yesterday. I'm gonna tell kind of a off-color story here. Yesterday I was in San Francisco, and I visited the Cathedral of Mary of the Assumption there. So I thought of this. The cathedral is a very modern, contemporary building. It's cement, and it's a giant dome. And a nickname that the church has in San Francisco is Our Lady of the 2 o'clock titty, because because at 2 o'clock the sun hits it in just the right way that it casts a shadow that looks like a breast on the ground. And I don't know if the architect meant to do that, but I think it's really great.
Oh, he meant to do that, all right. Come on now.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure. But it's like, it's really great because Mary was a mother and a woman, and that's all part of it. So I think it's awesome.
Yeah, I laugh, but Saint Bernard did have that vision that there are paintings of, which we can get into at another time.
We should
It's great.
post those on.
I mean, even just to go back to Clement really quickly, not, he's my homeboy. I love him. In Pedagogus, one of his best imageries is of a breastfeeding mother, which for the time is really kind of avant-garde to have that imagery, but he associated that with Mary and Christ and how special a child is to be able to associate with a mother like that. So bravo, architect, for bringing us an essential part of womanhood. Not that that was your intent, but hey, I'll take it.
I think it's great. And again, with what Mary Christine Athens was saying, like, we can't visualize Mary chewing gum or going to a beer party. I mean, talking about Mary's boobs, I think in the past it wasn't a big deal because, like, we do have that Saint Bernard image and, like, Our Lady of La Leche. But it seems like in the past few centuries, or at least maybe the past century, people got really prudish about talking about Mary. So it's like, she's a woman. Get over it,
Yeah, she may have been immaculately conceived, but she still gave birth. She still did what a woman had to do when she gave birth.
So, about the Immaculate Conception. So, I guess I didn't realize this. I mean, I knew a little bit about it, but it was kind of like the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, first of all, was not officially proclaimed until the 19th century, which I did know that. But it's got this history that's kind of fraught with contention. Really, to simplify, it falls into two authoritative camps. So, Augustine, who talks about Mary as, well, first of all, what frames this whole discussion of the Immaculate Conception is an understanding of original sin. Augustine is definitely the original sin guy. But what you believe about original sin informs what you feel about or believe about the Immaculate Conception. So Augustine felt and taught that original sin was passed on human to human through the concupiscence that was inherent in the act of procreation. So Mary is preserved from that in a special way. He says that she is an exception to that rule. And then after that, and he doesn't go any farther. He doesn't explain it any further. So then people go off in the centuries after him in different ways, believing different things about it. And Bernard, who is, of course, Bernard of Clairvaux, who is a big Mary guy and talks about Mary all the time, kind of famously did not believe in this idea of Immaculate Conception. Although the way Immaculate Conception was being talked about in Bernard's time was, and to my understanding, was very similar to how they were talking about Christ's conception, which was a virginal conception. So Bernard says that Mary's conception was not like that, was not a virginal conception, which is different than what the Immaculate Conception is saying. The Immaculate Conception is saying that somehow she was exceptional and did not contract original sin like the rest of us do. So it is definitely a belief that is present in the church, but like I said, it wasn't made official until 1854 when Pius IX promulgated the document Ineffabilis Deus, in which says that the Virgin was, this is a quote, the Virgin was preserved from all stain of original sin in the first moment of her conception. So that is where the feast that took place earlier this week comes from the mid-19th century. And again, like I said, how you understand original sin is really going to color how you understand Immaculate Conception. So I think that most Catholics, or at least most theologians, aren't going to understand original sin as being passed, kind of genetically through the sex act. But at the same time, original sin is a reality that we live with. I mean, you just look around, and it's pretty clear that that's something that's going on. But what it, how it's understood, I think, is probably different now than it was in Augustine's time. So the next feast that was this week, that new feast that's not new, but new for the universal calendar, is the Feast of Our Lady of Loreto. And my question to you guys is Our Lady of Loreto a Marian appellation that is on your radar? Because it definitely is not for me. Like, I don't really know anything about it.
I could have sworn that was one of her apparitions. Like
It's
the
not,
Loreto, or am I confusing that with LaSalle?
LaSalle was an apparition.
La Salette.
But Loreto, I thought was...
La Salette.
Good Lord. I'm just confused.
I have no recollection of Loreto at all.
So I'm wondering if this is like more maybe like a European thing.
Oh, I think it definitely is. I mean, I'm not unaware of it, but it's sort of scrambled with a bunch of other Our Lady ofs in my head.
That's how it was for me too. So I was like, I don't have like an emotional connection with this appellation of Our Lady, and I haven't ever really seen anything about it. And I've been around, so but I did a little bit of research, and the Our Lady of Loreto.
You said it, buddy.
What?
I said you said it, buddy, not us.
Loreto it circles around the house the house that the Virgin Mary lived in while she was alive, and apparently it is a shrine in Italy, and apparently somehow the legend is, I think we probably wouldn't give credence to this specific way of describing it now, but the legend is that Mary's house, after she died, was taken by angels and moved to, I think, Croatia, and then it was moved again by angels to Italy, where it is presently and where it's presently enshrined. So that's the story. And if you look at some kind of popular religious images of it, there's usually a house in the picture and some angels carrying it, and the Virgin Mary is kind of sitting on top of it. So again,
that's awesome. I wish I could have angels just like as my movers. They could do all the packing.
It'd make life a lot easier, I can tell you. After moving from Chicago to California, I definitely agree with you.
And I bet the cost of feeding them pizza and beer would be a lot lesser than like calling the rest of your buddies together.
Seriously.
Okay. Here's an interesting thing. So I went to Google Our Lady of Loreto, and I am fascinated that more churches pop up in the search than anything about the actual feast. So many of them are in California. So that's fascinating to me because it's, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like 7 entries before the Wikipedia entry. And then even that is the Church of Our Lady of Loretto. Whoa, okay. That's bizarre.
You said a lot of them are in California?
Yeah, there's at least, I would say out of the entries I saw, at least 3 of them, 4 of them were in California.
Weird. Well, we do here in the Diocese of Sacramento, we do have a religious order, a community of women called the Sisters of Loretto. So I don't know any of them, but they are definitely around. So maybe that's part of the connection. So now I want to turn really quickly, and I know I've gone a little bit longer than maybe I should have, but just to talk about apparitions. So the next feast coming up tomorrow is Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is one of these so-called apparitions of the Virgin Mary. And the difference between an apparition and a dogma is that a dogma, like the Immaculate Conception, is the church is enjoined by a dogma to believe in that teaching in some way, shape, or form. The church will recognize apparitions and has recognized at least 10. I think there might be 12 now, but in Pelican's list, there are 10. But apparitions can be judged by the church, are sometimes judged by the church as worthy of belief. But you can go your whole Catholic life or your whole Christian life and not believe in, an apparition, and it's totally fine. It is not enjoined on you as a Christian or a Catholic to believe in it, but the church will judge whether an apparition is worthy of belief. And then if it is, then, go for it. The apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe is one of these approved apparitions, and it took place in Mexico in 1531 to a native Mexican named Juan Diego. She appeared to him on the Tepeyac Hill, which was actually a place where a native goddess was worshipped, but that's where Mary appeared to him. And so what's really cool about this apparition is that Mary appeared to Juan Diego as a native person, so someone with darker skin, and she affirmed to him that she was, there for him, that she was his mother. So something that Yaroslav Pelikan brings out in his chapter on apparitions is that Mary takes the side of the poor in this situation and in many situations. If you look at the listing of approved apparitions of the Virgin Mary, usually she's appearing to people who are poor or children or, kind of marginal. And I think that this kind of liberative aspect of Mary, first of all, underscores the church's teaching about preferential option for the poor. But it also reflects in the prayer, the Magnificat, which is scriptural, the prayer that Mary utters when she goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, where she says that, God has cast down the mighty and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the good things, that he has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he's sent away empty. So I think that's a really important thing to remember when we're thinking about these apparitions, is that they don't come out of nowhere. They're always tied somehow to our understanding, our traditional and scriptural understanding of Mary. But they, are special messages and special reminders of what Mary, and basically of what Christ has to say to us in the Gospels.
I would say for myself, one of the most fascinating parts of the apparition at Guadalupe is that the Blessed Mother actually left behind a physical reminder of her presence. That part of the story is that she told Juan Diego, I would like a church or a chapel to be built on this hill. Go tell the bishop. He goes and tells the bishop, and the bishop's like, man, I mean, I don't know. Here's a random guy coming in from the countryside. And he says, I need some evidence that she's really asked to this. And later on, he ends up filling, he has this smock that he wears as part of his just native wear. He fills with roses that are suddenly blooming on this hill, and he goes to show these miraculous roses because they're blooming out of season. He gathers them all up and goes to show the bishop. And when he, sort of drops his smock to show all these flowers, there's this image of Our Lady of Guadalupe on his smock, on his tilma. And that image has been subject to so much investigation because they can't figure out how it got onto the fabric. It wasn't painted. It wasn't dyed. They can't they can't figure out how it's there. They can't figure out how the tilma still exists. It should have rotted away. There have been several times where it should have burnt or exploded. They've actually found when they put Mary's eyes under a microscope, they find that there's microscopic reflections in her eyes that show what looks like a native, like a man dressed as a bishop and witnesses looking at her.
Oh wow, that's cool. I didn't know that.
There's a lot of symbolism in what she's wearing that would speak to the native Aztec tribe, that the colors she's wearing and the clothes she's wearing indicate that she is a pregnant woman, but that she is also a queen. And her robe, there's stars on it, and they've actually mapped them to the constellations. They've actually found like a specific place that where you look up and it looks exactly like that. It's really, really interesting. If you're interested, go and Google this. There's the symbolism in this. It's one of those images that, like the Shroud of Turin, there's been a lot of scientific investigation and people going back and forth. But the more they look into it, the more weird and mysterious this image gets. So even if you're not into Our Lady, even if you're not sure about apparitions, it's just a really interesting thing to look into.
Well, Our Lady of Guadalupe is definitely really special to me. I mean, I grew up in the West. She is ubiquitous. I mean, you see Our Lady of Guadalupe everywhere. She's definitely one of the first images of Our Lady that I remember seeing, aside from the the garden Our Lady of Grace that's in everybody's yard. But yeah, so I guess that's it. There are a handful of approved Marian apparitions. Mary appears to a lot of people. Like if you look into this, there's like Marian apparitions all over the place. But the church is always very, kind of cautious about evaluating them. And so Our Lady of Guadalupe is one of those approved ones. One of the most famous ones, really. Our Lady of Lourdes and Our Lady of Fatima would be the other really big ones. But there are a few on this list that I'd never even heard of. So there's some out there for research if you wanna look into it. And then of course Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal that we talked about a couple weeks ago with Catherine Labouré is another one of those approved apparitions. Anyway, that's my piece for today. So maybe we can talk about Mary some more in Nestorianism.
Did you talk about Our Lady of La Salette? Because if you didn't, I think I'm going to cry.
I didn't talk about Our Lady of La Salette because we are going to do an episode on Our Lady of La Salette. Our Lady of La Salette, listeners, is very important to both Erica and I. Christine, is she important to you as well?
Yes, she is.
Well,
yes.
I don't know your life.
I don't know you.
For reasons that involve Padre Pio and others.
Wait,
Okay.
I know why. I know why she's important, because part of your family is from New England, and she is a New England. Well, I mean, she's not from New England. She's French, but because of the French Canadian, she's a very New England saint.
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
I
we can
like
go with
her.
that, but that's not it.
Okay.
But because she says some things at La Salette that tie into things that she says in other places. Oh, it's interesting. We can go into that if we want to, but that's going to be at least another episode.
Exactly. So we have to do an episode on Our Lady of La Salette. And I like her because she appeared on my birthday. So, or what would become my birthday a century and a half later. So,
Yeah, so Nestorianism. When Seth said he was going to cover Mary and some major Marian feast days, we decided that Nestorianism would be a good heresy of the week. So, Nestorianism is one of the Christological heresies from the early church when they were still figuring out who and what this Jesus person was. And it was advanced by Nestorius, who lived around 386 to 450, who was actually the Patriarch of Constantinople from 428 to 431. And he didn't originate his teachings. Just like Arius, this idea that he had, these beliefs that he had been around for a while. It's just when things came to a head, he was kind of the guy that represented this thought. So he had studied under Theodore of Mopsuestia. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, at the school of Antioch. And his main divergence from everyone else, what he thought, he had this idea that the Christness of Jesus, the Christness of Jesus Christ, and the Jesusness, like the part that was human and the part that was divine, were entirely separate. There were basically two persons going around in one body at that time. And this was at the time that he was, coming up in the faith and becoming patriarch and all of, learning and then becoming patriarch. This wasn't that unusual a belief. It may not have been the absolute majority, but like with Arianism that we covered last time, it hadn't been settled yet. And people, a lot of people were going back and forth. It wasn't really a big deal. But then when it becomes a big deal, what became the controversy is when this is where his name really gets attached to this, because that's what he did. He publicly challenged the long-used title Theotokos, which is the bringer forth of God, or it's usually translated as God-bearer, for the Blessed Mother. And you still see this. The Eastern Orthodox, this is their title for the Blessed Mother. She is Theotokos. A lot of the icons of her will show her, and there'll be this sort of cutaway window of a very mature looking baby Jesus in her belly, because she is Christ is coming through her. She is the bringer forth of God. And he said that this title as the bringer forth of God denied his full humanity, denied Jesus' full humanity, because he said that Jesus had two persons, the divine Logos and the human Jesus. And so he proposed Christotokos, bringer forth as Christ, as more suitable for Mary. Well, this was quite the scandal. And his opponents thought that it was very close to the heresy of adoptionism, which we haven't covered yet. We probably will in the future. But it was the idea that Jesus had been born a man, but then was adopted as God's son. So they thought that what Nestorius was saying was too close to that he was so emphasizing the human aspect that the divine aspect was secondary, or artificial. And his main critic was Cyril, the Patriarch of Alexandria, who again argued that his teachings undermined the unity of Christ's divine and human natures at the incarnation. What some other people were saying was that it creates a fracture in the singularity of Christ, thus creating two Christ figures. And Nestorius always insisted that his views were absolutely orthodox. And honestly, from his point of view, they probably were. This is what he had been taught in the faith. This is what the school of Antioch had been teaching. It wasn't until he decided to change the title for Mary that people got all up in arms. But then at the First Council of Ephesus in 431, his teachings were deemed heretical, and it led to the Nestorian schism, where the churches supportive of Nestorius separated, and there was a more elaborate theology that developed within the Nestorian church from there, and eventually it went out into the east, but it mostly died. There were some churches that were called Nestorian, but even the ones today that still revere Nestorius generally don't fully subscribe to that doctrine, but they do all avoid the term Theotokos. So that basically, this idea did move east after Nestorius. You have it showing up in the Persian church. You have it showing up in China, like Manichaeism did. But then it gets overcome and overwhelmed by Buddhism and Islam, and so is pretty much overwhelmed and gone by the end of the 14th century from the world. But when I was reading up on this, and on this idea of the Christness, the divine nature of Jesus being separate from the human nature, that you have basically Jesus and Christ, and they're not actually unified. This actually struck a memory in me. It reminded me of a concept that I had encountered in some of my wanderings, where people would talk about Christ consciousness. And this was always in a New Age context. Christ consciousness, you shall, if you meditate enough and love enough, you shall ascend to Christ consciousness. There was always a lot of like woo New Age blah blah about it. So I wanted to look into this and actually see if there was a connection. And there isn't a hard connection between what we might consider formal Nestorianism, but this later idea that crops up that is very, very similar. And I wanted to talk about this because this is part of the reason why when we were first discussing doing this podcast, from very, very early on, I was like, we should do a heresy of the week, because most of us don't learn about the historical Christian heresies. And part of the problem of that then is that a lot of these old ideas that, fairly or not, were discarded earlier and already dealt with, they keep coming back because people don't know about them. People can't recognize them when they see them. So I thought this was a good example of how it's not exactly the same belief, but it's close enough that if someone already knew about Nestorius, knew about Nestorianism, they could see where this idea might eventually lead to. Because I do think this is an endpoint of where Nestorianism might have gone. We talked about my geeking out over Manichaeism in an earlier episode about, wow, one or two changes and you could have had a really, really messed up religion. Well, what we have showing up in the New Age movement is something like Nestorianism, but I mean, imagine 2,000 years of change. And if you make the right changes, you might end up with something like this. So in order to talk about Christ consciousness, I actually have to go back before that term is actually used so much. And we are going to talk about a little bit, just very briefly, about theosophy. This is a term that has existed in Western culture for centuries and centuries and centuries. But in the modern sense, it's really talking about the teachings that flow from the Theosophical Society founded by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. And she is in the Western occult, Western esoteric tradition. She is one of the most prominent modern figures of it. Most of modern Western occultism is heavily influenced by her, if not directly descended from her teachings. And so she lived, just a little bit about her, she lived 1831 to 1891, was born into an aristocratic Russian-German family. In Russia, she traveled around a lot. She went to Europe, the Americas, India. She said that she went to a place called Shigatse, Tibet, where she trained under the masters of the ancient wisdom to develop psychic powers. In the 1870s, she was involved in the spiritualist movement. She co-founded the Theosophical Society with some other people in 1875. So she founds the Theosophical Society, which is theosophy. She had this idea that there had been this ancient religion of wisdom in the ancient world that, all the ancient religions have actually descended from, and that all the ancient religions, all the pre-Christian societies had this ancient and superior wisdom, but it was totally devoid in Christianity. So even though she had been raised in the Russian Orthodox Church, she wholesale rejected Christianity. She kept a sentimental attachment to Russian Orthodoxy, but the rest of it she didn't like. And part of the beliefs that she had was the masters of wisdom, and these were people who had sort of attained great wisdom and great powers and were the great teachers of mankind. So as soon as she founds the Theosophical Society, she personally kicks out all Christianity. But very soon after, there's a lot of splinter groups that come off. And among them, you have this guy named C.W. Ledbetter, I think, and Alice A. Bailey. And they were taught by the Theosophical Society, but then they sort of splintered off with this thing called the I Am activity. And they have a release in the 1930s called the Ascended Masters. And it's the idea of the Ascended Masters is different than the Masters of Ancient Wisdom. And the whole reason I'm not going into a lot of detail is this gets very confusing very quickly. But the idea of the Ascended Masters is these are individuals who were once embodied on Earth, learned the lessons of their life in their incarnations. Yes, they believed in reincarnation. It's very Buddhism and Hindu heavy. And these people, they gained mastery over their limitations of the material planes. They balanced at least 51% of their negative karma and fulfilled their dharma, which is the divine plan. And so an ascended master is someone who has literally ascended to another state of being where they become godlike and a source of unconditional love to all life, and through the ascension has united themselves with their own God self, or the I am presence that the I am activity is named after. And yes, they take the I am from the Old Testament word, the tetragrammaton, the name of God. So they believe that these ascended masters serve as teachers for mankind, that all of mankind is on this journey to join them. And they believe that among the various ascended masters are people like Master Jesus, Confucius, Gautama Buddha, Mary, the mother of Jesus, St. Paul of Tarsus, aka Hilarion, Melchizedek, the Archangel Michael, Metatron, Kuan Yin, who is a bodhisattva, St. Germain, who's kind of an interesting character if he actually even existed, and Kuthumi, I guess is it's going to sound really irreverent, some Hindu guy. And so the idea of this is that the Christ consciousness is something that exists separate from Jesus. It is something that anyone can attain. So the connection.
Can I ask a question about this?
Oh yeah, it's so weird. Go for it.
So, is it sort of like you can follow any one of these masters, or do you have to accept all of them?
Yes. Probably. So
Got it.
I'm so in all of my wanderings, theosophy was actually one of the few things I really didn't get into. So I'm not as well versed in the practice of theosophy, but my understanding is you recognize all of them, but there's always going to be like one or two that you naturally gravitate toward. And that you just have a better natural connection with. And they would say, well, that's because that's where your path is right now. And the idea is that this ascended state is sometimes called the Christ consciousness. And it's called that because they say Jesus, the reason he's special, in their teaching is because he achieved this ascended state. He's remembered because he achieved this ascended state, was a, teacher for mankind. But the core of that comes down to that the Christness, the divine nature of Jesus was separate. It was separate from Jesus in that it wasn't unique to Jesus. Whereas as Catholics and most, mainline Christians at least, recognize that the divine nature of Jesus and the human nature of Jesus were intertwined, that there is only one Christ, and that is Jesus, the Son. Whereas the theosophical teachings will say the Christ is a title, and anyone can, it's a state of being. Anyone can achieve that. And when you separate out the divine nature, the Christness, from the human nature, the Jesusness, that is the root of that. That's where that idea begins. You separate out those two ideas, and now suddenly Christness isn't necessarily unique to Jesus. So that's the relationship that, when I was reading about Nestorianism, that's what pinged in my memory. And that's why I think if you're familiar with Nestorianism and the early heresies, and you say, okay, yes, that's sort of the root idea that might eventually evolve into something like what the theosophical off branches teach, which are what become the New Age movement. It's good to understand how that happens because it helps you see it faster, and it also helps you see the danger. Like, I don't think Nestorius was a bad guy. I think he had some ideas that I personally disagree with, but I don't think he was a bad guy. But I think he was absolutely wrong. And part of the reason I think he was wrong is that you can see in the New Age, these New Age ideas, what happens when you take them down the line. Once you start separating the divinity of Christ from his human nature, what does that mean down the line? What weird places can some nutcase take it? And yeah, we can't judge all of our theology about what will some nutcase do, but we can at least do some due diligence on it and try to note the most obvious routes. And I think Nestorianism actually really was. It was a mistake, and it could have gone some really weird places. And when you kind of get its pseudo-resurrection with the New Age teachings that are descended from Blavatsky's teachings, you get some weird places because now it's once anyone can ascend, then the nature of Christness depends on your point of view. It's suddenly it's not you trying to align with God, it's you remaking God, the concept of God according to your desire. And that's one of the major problems with the New Age. And that's absolutely rooted in this idea of everyone can ascend and become Christ. So that is Nestorianism, and that is a wee taste of New Ageism too. So
yeah, I think just something I was thinking of is, it sounds I'm gonna make a judgment on what you just presented on when that's about all I know about it.
Yeah.
It sounded kind of complicated.
Oh, it's so complicated.
And I guess probably when we talk about Christianity, people would think it sounded complicated too. Maybe, I don't know. But I feel like that was also a problem with Nestorius, is that the way he used language, like he introduced this language like prosopon when that was not a term that was really being used, and so it was kind of confusing and people weren't sure what he meant about it. So again, like clarity of language is really important.
It really is, and so is discipline and making sure that things are not simply as you would prefer them to be. I think that, what I just said is more of a complaint about where it pops back up again in the New Age more than anything Nestorius was doing. But yeah, there's a lot of complications, and I know it can be, you might say, well, it's equally complicated to say that one guy was 100% human and 100% divine. That's 200%, but we're dealing with superpositions and beyond quantum natures. So just say Jesus was divine, Jesus was human. It is beyond our comprehension. Done. We don't have to comprehend it any more than that. And as someone who's always looking to understand more, when I say we're done, we understand what we need to understand, we're done.
Yeah. Again, this stuff had to percolate for so long. So, the Council of Ephesus was sort of a mess.
Yeah.
The second Council of Ephesus was even worse. It's not even considered a council. It's usually called the Robber Synod. This kind of like
that was the synod where we kidnapped everybody. I mean, like, for real. We joke about it happening at the others, but that was just a shame, is what that was.
Yeah, that's where Flavian got beaten to death. So this was not a mess around meeting. So they didn't really, the church didn't really come to grips with this until Chalcedon, which was in the next century. And I think we still, I don't think we can just stop at these 4th, 5th, 6th century philosophies and theologies. I think we need to understand what these mean for us now. They still are meaningful to us, but we don't have the same worldview as the church fathers. So we have to, always be looking at what these mean. Just like with original sin, just like with Immaculate Conception, like we can't just live in this 5th century, 4th century world. And
and what does it mean to define Christ through Mary? I guess that kind of irks me. It doesn't kind of irk me. It does. It's philosophically inadequate. You can apophatically talk about God. You can apophatically talk about Christ. You can cataphatically talk about God and Christ. But describing Christ being via Mary, I think, is sneaky. I think it's a sneaky cop-out, when by that point there was other philosophy that could determine matter of a being. So yeah, I'm not a fan. Arius, I feel bad for Arius, but yeah, Nestorianism is problematic.
Yeah. So just for our listeners, you used two terms, one of which, so probably both of which I'm familiar with, but apophatic and cataphatic.
So apophatic means you're describing something via negativa, by what it's not. You are saying everything that basically you are saying nothing directly about the thing. God is not finite. God is not terrible. Cataphatic would mean that you are positively describing something, which honestly in the Western world is the way that we describe things most of the time. Something is something else, without having any sort of negation there. But apophatic descriptions happen much more in the Eastern world, in the Eastern rite of the church, and still do, whereas the Western Roman end seem to pick up the cataphatic. So just a little bit of a difference there between those two and how they're used. I like using apophatic terms, and I like going over it with my students because I think it enables you to not define something so strictly by only terms that you have available to you. So when you start describing something in positive terms, I am this, I'm a mom, I'm a woman, I'm already placing constraints on myself. And I think placing constraints on God is always, always, always problematic for me. So
Agreed.
apophatic language helps.
Okay.
And that's kind of what you were saying with when we talked about Athanasius and Arius, Christine, is that like this is sort of beyond our pay grade, and that's what's so great about apophatic
Right.
language. And it's really the language of mystics usually, because they have these, experiences, and they're like, there's no way to talk about this as a human being, but I'm gonna try.
Absolutely. I remember when I first discovered the concepts when we were all in undergrad, and I'm sure I encountered this through you guys in one of our many discussions at that time, and learning about like the apophatic approach. I fell in love with that so hard for all the reasons you've just given, is that I had a problem with defining that which was beyond definition. How can you constrain that which is so much bigger than us that the entire universe cannot contain it? We're supposed to use words. So, yeah, I've always been a fan, but it's good for our listeners to know about it, because if I hadn't known you guys, I would never have learned about it. And a lot of times when I'm hearing people, various online pop theologians, the apophatic approach never comes up. Everything is sort of the cataphatic. And in fact, when some people they'll talk about someone sometimes, and I can't point to a specific instance because this is always when I'm listening to YouTube videos while I'm at work, so I'm only half paying attention. But there have been some times when I've gotten irritated because they'll criticize someone who's clearly using apophatic language, and they'll call it borderline heretical, where it's just a different approach. It's not heretical at all. So that is definitely a legitimate approach to contemplating God. I find it's when you're working on meditation, the apophatic approach is really helpful, just to try to realize that you cannot imagine God sufficiently. You can only get pieces of it, and it helps keep you humble and keeps you in wonder, which sometimes we forget.
Well, and I think even wonder is so important, and awe is so important. And one of the things that I feel we as not the triumvirate here, that we as a people, and that was very governmental. I know. Actually, I was thinking we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect
Oh,
union,
right, that one
establish
too.
justice,
That's much better than
ensure
what I was
domestic
thinking.
tranquility, provide for the common defense, that we the people. I I feel like we are taking concepts like opinion and perspective and preference and adding truth to it. So my opinion is not big T truth. My preferences are not a truth. And I think Seth and I want to bring up virtue ethics at some point so we can talk about concepts like truth. But it does bother me because, we're talking about the truth of Christ and the truth of God. And that's very hard to pinpoint if it's even possible for humans to understand. And so, Christine, we come back to wonder and awe as the default standpoint of where we should be looking, really.
Agreed. So that was quite a divergence from where we started. But I think definitely a lot of things to come back to in future episodes. Probably next time we hit in one of our future mysticism episodes, I think we can definitely hit a bit more on apophatic approach and maybe some examples in history, and we can take it from there. But in the meantime, we'll give me a rest. Erica, what do you have for us this week?
Okay. So I have a little discussion about Lucia, Santa Lucia. I will refrain from singing the song, although I really like to sing, but I'm not going to sing for
No,
all
you
of you.
have to sing.
No, I'm not going to sing the song. But Saint Lucia, Saint Lucy, her feast day is Friday, correct? December 13th is Friday. Yes.
Yes.
And she's a very interesting saint because of how she ties into some of our Christmas or Yule time activities. Yule refers to a lot of the traditions that came out of Northern Europe around the time of Christmas, but that are not necessarily Christianity related, but are more related to what we now call pagan, but I prefer to call Druidism or native religions, native practices of the people in Scandinavia. So, but we're going to take a step back for a second. Lucia, and I'm going to use her Italian name because, well, she's Italian and I'm Italian. Even though my name is Erica, which isn't very Italian at all, but I promise you my last name is very Italian. Anyway, so Lucia of Syracuse was born in 283 AD and she died in 304 AD in Syracuse, not New York, Sicily. So, born and died in Sicily, she was born to, I wouldn't say a rich family, but a very, what would be considered in Roman times, a wealthy family. Definitely not, one of the plebeians. And it's important to situate where she is in history because you'll kind of see how her life unfolded. At the time, Diocletian was one of the emperors. So Diocletian was the Holy Roman Emperor of the East, and Maximus was the emperor in the West, and they both had consuls that helped them all along the borders of Rome. So this is interesting because Diocletian was not technically the next in line first. So if you go back, we're talking about late, really late in the Roman Empire. Um, for those of you who know anything about Rome, you at first had the Republic, and so the Republic ended when Octavian Caesar Augustus took over, and from that point he declared himself Holy Roman Emperor. And at that point, some problems broke out with condemning Christians, depending on who was in power at the time. And Diocletian was one of those people who is accused of persecuting Christians. So I will say Christians were persecuted at the time. They were killed, and it was really bloody and merciless. Nero would have been another one, Caligula, and then you had some relatively good emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, who built the wall in the north. Anyway, so Diocletian was not a good emperor in terms of that. But part of it, I think, I'm going to say, just going out on a limb here, he does get a little bit of a bad name because at first he was really a military guy, and that's how he came into power. He was basically voted into power or um, pushed into power a little bit with the help of his army. So he didn't have necessarily the vote of the people, which at the time, since it's not a republic, that didn't really matter. And then he asked Maximus to rule with him because he had absolutely no interest in being in Rome. He lived in what is now considered modern day Croatia, so close to Nicomedia, and he liked being in the East. He conquered the East. He ruled the East, and so this was where he wanted to be and where he felt most useful. And honestly, it seemed like every time he left that area, something went wrong and he got kicked back over there. Maximus, and this is very interesting to me, and because I'm such a nerd, Maximus didn't stay in Rome much either. Maximus actually was north in what would be the area of Austria and Germany right now. So fascinating that as far as emperors go, most of our emperors were actually not in Rome. Okay, so why is
I
this
would
important?
never have known that. I just
Right?
I assumed it was Rome or Constantinople.
And so one of them, so Diocletian was Constantinople area, so he kept that as the eastern seat. But I think because of the constant wars going on, Maximus was in Rome sometimes, but not most of the time. His home was in the north. Fascinating. So as the story goes, and I say story because I know you've heard Seth a couple times talking about the Golden Legend. It's where we get a lot of our juicy stories on the saints. It's very exciting. I'm going to talk about Lucia from the standpoint of the Golden Legend, and partially because it's one of the only written accounts that we have of Lucia's life. A lot of the others, you have oral traditions or things that were added on, but we'll talk about that. So, Lucia was a native of Sicily, and growing up, she would have been worshiping the local gods and goddesses native to Sicily, but also the Roman pantheon. Her mother was Greek and her father was Roman, but he died when she was really, really young. So this caused some problems in the family because I'm not going to go into the long history of what happens in Rome, but when the head of the household dies, it has to be a man. So even though she was his legitimate wife and they had their daughter, without a male figure in the household, there is an absence of power. So the man had all of the power in the Roman household. The women had power over the actual house. So the home, the slaves, the worship, that was their area, and that is really where their quote power came in. But with him gone, her mother would have felt back in at that time that Lucia could potentially have a problem growing older because she was not betrothed yet. She did have money. They both had money, and her mother, as the legend goes, did fairly well with the father's money after his death. But as Lucia gets older, the question is going to be, without her father to make a match to marry her off to another family, what's going to become of her? So her mother finds a wealthy patron, and it is a patron because usually girls were betrothed as young as 12, 13, 14, pre-menopausal, pre-menstruation, and prepubescent, and they would then um, marry and they would move into their husband's household. And then it's at that point that, they would have children eventually. So it's a very complicated system, and Lucia's mother apparently tried to make sure that she was part of this system. So wealthy patron says that he's going to marry her. He is very wealthy, and this secures Lucia's future permanently. So at the time, though, Lucia's mother was also getting sick. So she had something that, okay, bear with me, people. She had something that the Golden Legend describes as the bloody flux. So, no, it does not mean she was menstruating. We're talking about that a lot, though, in this episode. So, very interesting. But it seems that she had a chronic case of something like dysentery. And for those not familiar, it's caused by inflammation of the abdomen, of the intestines, resulting in bloody diarrhea. And it's most common in that era would have been a bacteria, maybe a parasite like an amoeba spreading through contaminated water or food, but most likely water because there was no water purification. And if somebody went to the bathroom in the water or washed dirty clothes, then there you go, it's in the water system. So her mother was sick, very sick, and she was not getting any better. So Lucia had read a story about Saint Agatha, who was a also local. There was a shrine, apparently a big shrine to Saint Agatha, and this was really important to Lucia because she felt that she could have her mother healed. Lucia had heard the stories of a woman touching Jesus's cloak and being healed of her ailments, and this is what she wanted her mother to do. So, because of their attachment to Agatha in her town of Syracuse, and because of Agatha's deep devotion to Christ, she and her mother went to the shrine to touch Agatha's sepulcher, so her little shrine area, and to pray at the stones, touch whatever items were there, and hopefully her mother would be healed. Well, as the story goes, they fell asleep. And I like I'm sorry, who falls asleep at a random shrine? That's a little weird. All right, I'm okay. But Agatha appears to Lucia in her dream as she's sleeping and tells her that she is an awesome Christian, that God loves her and God wants her to serve him for the rest of her life. So, Lucia was really moved by this. She wanted to give her whole life, dedicate it from that point on to God, Christian God, and she started to give away all of her wealth. And she told her mother that no, I'm gonna give all of my stuff to the poor. And she was like a teenager at the time, so her mom's like, no, you ain't. And she did. Got into big trouble for it. Not only that, she started to give the dudes money away. I mean, this was a really big. I know,
I mean,
You're
honestly, that's give
like,
your own money away is fine, but like stealing to give that money
right?
away,
It's like Robin Hood. So.
No. Robin Hood was taking back the money that had been stolen from the poor people
That's true.
by the government. Okay.
Yeah, I agree. This was
Yeah.
like outright thievery.
Yes.
So she takes the money and she gives it away to the poor, and she feels really happy and good about herself. But her mom was cured, so positive there. In the meantime, though, she pissed absolutely everybody off in Syracuse. And a judge, they call it a judge, but the judges at the time, if you think about like Pontius Pilate, it would have been that type of scenario. So more of like a governor. Anyways, he told her that she had to denounce Christianity, worship the gods, go back to this guy, say she's sorry, marry him, give him a bunch of boys so that way everybody's happy. But she refuses, typical teenager. She says, I don't want to do that. And so ultimately, the judge, the governor, tells the men of Syracuse that they can take her and abuse her physically and take her away to the brothel. What? So, Golden Legend goes, it is, I mean, like, really? Wow. Golden Legend goes on to state that the Holy Spirit made her so physically heavy that they could not move her from the spot. And so that made the governor even more angry. And he's like, you know what? I don't know if any of you have seen Inside Out with your kids, but that scene where the dad goes, the foot is down, the foot is down. That's basically what this governor did with Lucia. And he's like, you're done, out of here. So he ordered her to be executed. And it wasn't pretty, folks. It was really bad. The account says it took her a while to die, sword through the throat, very, very unpleasant stuff. So these are things that are not included in the Golden Legend that are commonly talked about when people talk about Saint Lucia, Santa Lucia. Taking Christians through the catacombs with a lit wreath on her head, so that her hands had more availability to carry food to them. Okay. The catacombs are in Rome, and she was in Sicily. The girl lived, was born, died, made a mess in Sicily. Is it possible that at some point in her teenagehood, in between praying to Saint Agatha, curing her mom, giving everybody's money away, and being executed, that she went to Rome? I mean, anything is possible, but is it highly likely? No, it's probably not, and it is not written anywhere in the Golden Legend, and I cannot find a source of where that came from. The other one is that she lost her eyes when she was executed. Again, wasn't in the legend. It seems to be a popular theme that comes up with her, that her eyes were taken out, but it's not, I can't find any official writing for it. So it could have been added earlier. It could have been added later. It over time these oral traditions change depending on the need of the people. So, why did I bring up Diocletian? Why did I bring up Maximus? Well, a couple reasons. First of all, she was persecuted, but so similar to Jesus, she was persecuted by a local governor who had the go ahead of Diocletian to kill the Christians and had the go ahead of Maximus to kill the Christians. But some of the accounts that you read make it sound like it was Diocletian's direct order, and it was not. The other thing to bring up is patroness of the blind, and this comes with having her eyes gouged out. There was a case in Verona much, much later. I think we're like late medieval maybe, and the children suffered from a rash of blindness. So many children were having problems with going blind, and the story goes that they walked to the shrine of Lucia barefoot and begged her to restore their children's sight, and the children were healed of their blindness. So this is probably one of the accounts that links her to being patroness of the blind and to being somebody who cures blindness. And so we have the eye account at the execution gets added retroactively. The other interesting thing is, I don't know if anybody noticed, but I've been talking a whole lot about Italy, and yet St. Lucy, definitely before I started doing theology, St. Lucy to me was a Swedish saint, and it was always St. Lucy. And other than the song, and I really never put two and two together, other than the song, I never heard her referred to as Santa Lucia. So, how did that happen? Well, apparently, Christian missionaries who had gone to Italy had learned the story of Santa Lucia and taken the legend back north with them into the Scandinavian countries, particularly Sweden. At that time, the native people in the area had a very strong um, belief in celebrating the winter solstice. Because remember, we are talking about native religions, we're not talking about Christianity. And so their connection to nature was incredibly, incredibly strong. So it seems that in Sweden in particular, we have a combination of Santa Lucia and their own belief system.
So was there a connection between Lucia and the solstice?
Yes. So early on her first feast days, Lucia's feast was always on the winter solstice.
Okay.
And it got changed a few times. It was changed, I think, in the 1970s for us, but it was changed much earlier than that when they redid the calendars. But originally, her feast day was on the winter solstice. So if any of you recall pictures, if you've seen pictures of St. Lucy, she is usually a girl dressed in white with a red sash. She has an evergreen wreath, sometimes of lingonberry. For those of you who go to IKEA, you should know what lingonberries are by now.
Oh, yes.
On their heads, yes, and with candles. And so this harkens back again. We have the story of her going into the catacombs with a wreath on her head and candles, but this possibly again was added on at a later time. The connection in Scandinavia, they celebrate in Sweden specifically Lucia Dagen, and she is the bringer and the renewer of the light, going from the darkest time of the year, transmuting basically into the time of light, and we start getting longer days, and spring is coming, even though sometimes I live in the north, it feels like it's really, really not, but it is. And so the imagery harkens back to, the Golden Legend and St. Lucy being this light. And if you read the Golden Legend, what's interesting is it opens up talking about her as a saint that's associated as very being in the light, of being submerged in light. And it's actually really, really beautiful imagery. So in Sweden, fast forward to modern day, in Sweden, we have a lot of celebrations where they pick a girl. Sometimes now they even pick a boy. They pick a Lucia for the nation, and then they just about every school has some sort of celebration. The churches have celebrations. It is really, really, really big for them. And some of the pictures of it are quite pretty because it'll be a darkened street or a darkened church, and you have Lucia in her, or Lucy up there, in her white dress and her wreath of candles and evergreen. And the evergreen, because they don't die, they're constantly renewing. So really, really nice imagery. And they have their own cakes that they bake. And there is, because I love to bake and cook, St. Lucia buns. So especially in Sweden, they have these pastries that are just wonderful. King Arthur Flour has a nice recipe if you want, but
Please tell me you're going to share this on
I
social
will. I
media.
will. I will definitely
Okay.
share it. And honestly, for a yeasto, I know we're getting into a little bit of cooking here, but for a yeasto, it doesn't look that complicated. So I really would like to try them. It does have saffron in it, which is not wallet friendly, but you can substitute turmeric and it will not be quite saffron, but it will do just fine for those of us who don't have a wallet where we can go out and purchase saffron at the drop of a hat. So I will post that, but it is on kingarthurflower.com if you want to look it up before I have it up there. And then going back to Italy, all over Italy, there are different traditions based on Lucia. And the interesting thing is they're all different. In Sicily, they refuse to eat anything wheat on the day. So they completely take wheat out of their diet because at one point in history, they had a famine and they had no wheat. People were starving, and they prayed to Santa Lucia, and this is partly where the song comes from. And a boat of wheat shows up, and the story is that they were so hungry they didn't have time to mill the wheat; they just ate it in this pudding. So are no milled wheat products on Santa Lucia's feast day in Sicily. Now I don't know if that's still the case, but traditionally this is what they did. In Puglia, they do Occhi di Santa Lucia, the eyes of Santa Lucia, which is kind of weird, but
It's so morbid and creepy,
it
and I
really
love
is
it.
and awesome. You're gonna love it even more when I tell you that the ingredients are very simple. For the Occhi, it is flour, white wine, and olive oil.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
and they are iced.
What?
Yeah, I know. It's amazing. And they're iced with a basically a simple syrup, a confectioner's sugar, and water boiled down. But they're very popular in Puglia, and that's their thing. In northern Italy, so up towards uh, Verona, the border, they, and I did not know this at all, they view Santa Lucia almost like Father Christmas. So children leave letters out for her in in front of their houses, and they leave her coffee and biscuits and wine. And she
That's
is
my
such,
girl right
I
there.
know, right? That's the best
That's
triumvirate
a
ever.
Friday night.
And they say she's always on a donkey, so they leave hay for her donkey. And if you are a child and you are waiting up for Santa Lucia, or you wake up in the night and you see her, she throws hot ashes in your eyes so that you go back.
Dang. She don't play around.
Well, come on. She was executed. She's probably like, I'm not putting up with this
Fair
anymore.
enough. Fair enough. At this point, I guess you would be a tough old lady.
Right? So those are the basic, some of the, there's so many more. She is actually a really popular saint when it comes to all things Christmas, Yuletide. Like I said, she takes up some Father Christmas traditions, and it was really, really interesting reading about her because my tradition, and I'm not Scandinavian at all, people. I am like Mediterranean, full-blooded. So it was kind of interesting because I didn't know, and I'm not Sicilian. Well, I guess I'm part Sicilian. I'm more from Rome though. And those traditions were never something that I had known about. So that was pretty interesting. So my movie suggestion only very loosely relates to this at all. But because I started researching this and I cannot get that song. Okay, there's a very famous song. Google it. Google Santa Lucia song, and you will see like Eric Caruso and Andrea Botticelli and all these famous people singing the Santa Lucia song. But my own personal reference to the Santa Lucia song actually comes from Captain Corelli's Mandolin. So it is a movie that came out in 2001. It is 2 hours, 9 minutes long. It has a fairly good rating, 4.5 stars, with 189 reviews on Amazon, and IMDb has it at a 5.9 star. It's rated R, folks. I don't know what to tell you, okay?
Oops.
You had 2 weeks of me of having non-rated R stuff, but this one's really good, and really it's just it's a war movie, basically. So I don't know how many of you know about the invasion of Italy, parts of Greece, but basically, Italian soldiers, believe it's World War II. I'm almost positive. Watch it be World War One, and then somebody's going to be like, ma'am, it was not World War II, it was World War One. So, anyways, I'm pretty sure it's World War II. But this Greek island, Cephalonia, and it's actually a true story, was completely untouched by the wars, and it was finally invaded by the Italian soldiers. So that's like the truth in this story. And there's also a book that I've heard is much better even than the movie, Captain Corelli's Mandolin. And the head character, who's played by Nicolas Cage, is an Italian soldier who falls in love with a beautiful Greek girl and wants to marry her, but of course it comes with complications because he's Italian, she's Greek, and on and on and on. At one point, he serenades her in the square with the song Santa Lucia, and he kind of gets all of his comrades to sing with him. So that's my reference to to Santa Lucia. And Penelope Cruz plays his love interest. I really like the movie. I've watched it multiple times. You can rent it on Prime for $3.99. You can buy it for $15. I think there's DVDs listed for $10. And it generally has a good rating. I think the only complaint that I see consistently is it's a movie about Italians and Greeks, and we have Nicolas Cage and Penelope Cruz. So for me,
I was
because
just about to say
I
Nicolas
know.
Cage as an Italian.
Okay, he is Italian though. He's a
Wait,
Scorsese.
really?
Yeah. Oh yeah, he's from the Scorsese family, but he doesn't show it, right? Because
No.
he's only half. But he's not he's not the right person. And honestly, I love Penelope Cruz too, but I don't feel she's the right person for this either. John Hurt is in it. Christian Bale is in it. So it would have been nice to see some Greek, and well, especially Greek since they're on a Greek island, um, playing the parts, because I feel like we have so many good Greek actors and actresses that could have done an absolutely amazing job. So I guess I agree with the critiques of that. I think it could have been cast a little bit differently, but it was a popular casting. It was a typical Hollywood movie. So that is my story of the day. And I guess the takeaway is you've seen it or heard it when Seth speaks about it, and when Christine talks about the heresies in the ancient world, ancient to us certainly, and in the time of the Roman Empire, people are traveling all about, and sometimes it's hard to pinpoint where these legends started. And I think today we have like big T truth that we were talking about. Well, in the end, especially when it comes to somebody like Santa Lucia, the popular um, the popular traditions surrounding her are sometimes, I don't want to say more important, but equally important to what the truth is of where she came from and who she was. There are strands of truth of who she was in all of these little pericopes of stories, and certainly people that were moved by praying with her, whether we as outsiders believe them to be true or not. So Sweden, you're doing a great job. Continue on with your amazing St. Lucy festivities, and my Italian family, maybe someday you'll actually teach me how to make those cookies. I think it's not fair that I don't know. And I hope that we can continue to talk about the truth and perspective, whether it's the heresies or the saints or whatever subject happens to come up for us, I think, so that we can kind of piece some of these things out together. That's kind of the fun part for me.
Okay. Well, I think we're done for the evening. You guys have anything more?
No, thank you.
Okay. Well, then, everyone, we will see you probably next. Well, not see you. You'll hear from us in roughly a week.
We actually peek in your windows at night.
Well, we do love creepy stuff, so perhaps we are creepers. You don't know.
Yeah.
You don't know us.
We're gonna talk about the Krampus.
Krampus.
We are going to talk about Krampus next week. That's our goal.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to take a note on that. We're going to do that, people. Anyways, you all have a good Advent, and we will get back to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.